So good morning. By the way, I love this discussion. I totally want to talk to you afterwards. I mean, Federalist 1 by Alexander Hamilton is about civil discourse, right? I think I just did a podcast talking about that Hamilton and Jefferson hated each other, but they could agree and compromise. My buddy here, Benedict Arnold, was utterly uncompromising. I think if you are uncompromising in your principles and about your politics, you have more in common with Benedict Arnold than you do with Hamilton or Jefferson. So anyway, that's a whole different speech I have, but we're not going to do that one today. Today we're going to talk about George and Benedict. And it's great to be back, by the way, with Roseville. My son played for Mounds View and Roseville combined in the summer for soccer teams, and they won state twice being combined teams, and they were the Roseville parents. We used to go talk about combining opposites. We'd always go to each other's football games or soccer games, and it was always really special. So love Roseville. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two patriots, and I had a great time talking to the guys here in the back about Benedict and George. And one of the things people forget is the reason Benedict Arnold was such an amazing and astounding traitor is he was one of our greatest patriots. And of course, we all know about George Washington. So I always became interested in how Benedict became Benedict and how George became George, and hence the Becoming books, which is what I've written. And we start out, and we've got Benedict in the upper right-hand corner. This is Benedict as a colonel in the American Revolution, and he, of course, becomes a loyalist toady as a British general. And of course, George Washington, my first book, a lot of people don't know this, fought for the British in the French and Indian War. And all in life he really wanted was to be a British officer, but instead, of course, he becomes the ultimate rebel scum. And the question is, which are you? So this seemed like a little bit of a joke, but it kind of is and it kind of isn't. I spend a lot of time thinking about stuff like this, which is why I'm a nerd. If there was the revolution, would I have been a loyalist or would I have been a rebel? Right? And that's not an easy question. So my wife and I created what we call the Yoch test, clever name, that we did at my book release party. And here are sort of my questions. A little harder for some of you to see, so I'm going to read them. The first one is, are you a rule follower? Okay? If you're a rule follower, you were probably a loyalist, would be a loyalist toady, right? Have you benefited from the current political and economic system? If you are, you're probably a loyalist toady. Have you participated in anti-government protests? Well, if you have, you're probably rebel scum. Those are my tests, very rational, very straightforward. My wife's tests are much cleverer. Her tests are, do you like to get to the airport early? If you like to get to the airport early, it means you're probably a loyalist toady. If seats are open at a ball game and you're in your assigned seat, will you move to the closer seat? If you will move to the seat and leave your assigned seat to which you purchased and should be in, you are a rebel scum. By the way, if you haven't figured out, my wife is rebel scum. If there's a long line of people, is your first instinct to get in line or try to figure out a way to get around the line and figure another way in? If you're a line getter-inner, means you're probably a loyalist toady. All right, we're going to get back to that, but these are the questions you're going to need to think about while you're not listening or not listening to me. And by the way, I feel sorry for this thing to have to try to keep up with my speech. Okay, so let's compare these two patriots, because they were patriots. First of all, a lot of people have asked me who, and we just had a little discussion here, who was the greatest general of the Revolution? Was it George Washington? By the way, these are in their colonel's uniforms, but I really love these paintings, so that's why I'm using these. This was the first painting ever done of George. Or Benedict Arnold. Who was the greatest general? Not even close. This is Benedict Arnold as a general. Not even close. He was our greatest battlefield general. He was a tactical genius. He was crazy brave. So Benedict Arnold was our greatest general. He was indispensable to victory. Without Benedict Arnold, we would not have won the revolution. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. How about George Washington? Geez, Steve, you like George a lot. Said he's not our greatest general. Look, he was our greatest leader. George wasn't actually that great of a general. But he was our greatest leader. And without George, he is often called our indispensable founding father. And we'll talk about why. I think it's because of what he chose not to do. Okay, so who was our greatest hero of the revolution? I would actually say that up until Benedict's treachery, it was a close call. So why? Right? That's my next. Why How does Benedict Arnold become our greatest traitor? Who's our greatest general become our greatest traitor? How do we explain the differences? Right? How does he go to the dark side? How does one become Benedict Arnold? How does the other become George Washington? So I thought, are they opposite men? I would like to think then that they are just, it'd be obvious right away, right? They'd be polar opposites. You'd see the difference. It would be easy to understand. So I started by looking at their childhoods and did they have loving and supportive fathers? We all know, we were just talking about the cherry tree story, the Parson Weems story. Dad, I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down the cherry tree. Unfortunately, that is a complete lie. It was written by a guy named Parson Weems after George's death. It's wrong for a couple of reasons. One is because it never happened. Two is because it mischaracterizes George's relationship with his dad. His dad died when he was only 11. He did not have a close relationship with his father. Not that he was a bad dad, but he traveled all the time and just really didn't know his dad. And in fact, George would barely mention him through later life when talking, barely ever mentioned his father. So not close with his father. Benedict's even worse. His dad started out as an accomplished guy, but fell into hard times and ultimately became a drunken wharf rat. So great embarrassment to Benedict his whole life. How about loving and supportive mothers? So a lot of our presidents, you got Bill Clinton or FDR or Barack Obama, they're real close to their moms. They kind of push them along. Not the case here. In particular for George. He never got along with his mother. Now you say, Steve, what do you mean by that? Well, she didn't go to his wedding and could have. She didn't go to his inauguration and could have. I have many more really pretty funny stories about how awful she was to him. I think, by the way, George spent most of his life trying to escape his mother. Benedict Arnold's mother she was loving and she was very pious, but she was also sort of a weak person and died when he was relatively young. So she had very little impact on him. Okay, so not ideal childhoods, not ideal parents. How about world-class educations? Neither of them made it past the 8th grade. Both, because of financial reasons, had to be pulled out of school, which was a great embarrassment to both of them throughout their lives. Well, Washington, we know, was a wealthy planter, at least, right? He had Mount Vernon. Not true. He did not get Mount Vernon until much later in life. It was owned by his brother and his father, but he was really a middling gentry, and hence, by the way, he couldn't go past 8th grade. Benedict did come from a wealthy merchant family, but as we know, his father fell into disrepute, so he really had no money. So what we have is these two young men with no relationship with their fathers, neither were close to their mothers, both were out of school by the time they were 14. George became a surveyor, which was a respected profession, but he was a hard worker. Benedict ultimately becomes an indentured servant, which sounds bad, but it actually was a good job, and he became very involved as a successful trader as a result. So both Washington and Arnold were hardworking, industrious, and successful young men. So other than one having some mommy issues, another having some daddy issues, they had sort of similar upbringings. So I didn't feel like we start seeing the change there, so we start looking to friends and mentors, right? And they make a huge difference in our lives. George Washington became very close to the Fairfaxes, as in like Fairfax County, Virginia Fairfaxes, the Fairfaxes, in particular Lord and Colonel Fairfax, who became lifelong mentors to him right up until the Revolution when they had to leave because there was a revolution. But they really guided him, and he was very good at connecting with other people. In particular, this is his half-brother Lawrence. George's dad, Gus Washington, gets married. His wife dies, as they often did, in childbirth. He has two older brothers, Austin and Lawrence. This is his older half-brother. He's 12 years older. George's dad remarries, Mary Washington. George is the oldest of 6 in the second marriage. And Lawrence, because he wasn't close to his father, actually becomes his surrogate father. And if you go to Mount Vernon right now, this painting is in his study in Mount Vernon. And George said during his lifetime, if there was a fire at Mount Vernon, this is the only thing he would pull out of the house. He really was his surrogate father. Here he's dressed as a British military officer, which he was. And George spent a lot of his life emulating him. And so again, George made an intense personal connection with his brother. And of course, my first book is about the French and Indian War. George really learned a lot from the generals he fought under, both good and bad, but really connected with them. And this is a very famous painting, a little hard for you guys to see, but there's a guy in the middle getting shot. That's General Braddock. And right next to him on a horse in that blue uniform we saw earlier is George Washington. And George would be known until the Revolution as the hero of the Monongahela. Not, by the way, because he won the Battle of Monongahela here with Braddock, but because he saved the Army. Every single officer was either shot or killed, British officer, except George Washington. It would be the greatest defeat of the British Army until the Boer War, but he saved the Army. In contrast, Benedict, remember those indentured servants people, the Lathrops, who were really, really good to him. After some initial correspondence, we don't see any continuing connections between Benedict and the Lathrops, even though they were powerful like the Fairfaxes. But there's no indication of ongoing contact with mentors. Now, it's a little harder with Benedict because with George Washington, people kept correspondence they got with George, right? It became a family heirloom through the generations. When Benedict committed treason, a lot of his correspondence, people would go, "Ooh, I don't want that in my house," and they burned it. But we don't see any indication that the Lathrops continue to be close to him, even though they were a great help to him. And Benedict's friends were, judge me by my friends, right? Silas Deane, some of you may know the name. He was a famous guy early in the Revolution, helped finance the Revolution. Silas Deane is with Benedict, was at the early Continental Congresses, became involved in the Revolution, but fell into disrepute and in fact died in exile, very disillusioned with the Revolution, and he was arguably Benedict's best friend. Also Philip Schuyler, some of you Hamilton fans, this is Liza's father, father-in-law to Alexander Hamilton. By the way, I like Liza, so I always start with her. Philip Schuyler was a mentor of Benedict's, but he too fell out of favor, although unlike Silas Deane, not quite so much. And Benedict also was never fully able to connect to him as maybe he should have. Most of all, Horatio Gates, I think one of the really awful people of the Revolution, was George Washington's aide-de-camp, and Benedict really thought he was his friend and mentor. Gates became very, very jealous of Benedict's success and turned on him. So sometimes you just choose people who are not good friends who you think they are, and that really hurt Benedict. But most of all, George Washington. George was his mentor until George had to make some hard decisions and didn't support, and I'll talk about in a second, Benedict as much as he might, and that really hurt Benedict. And when his mentor didn't back him up, I think that's one of the many reasons that Benedict chose to go and support with the British. So while I'm a great admirer of George Washington, he did not manage either his general or his friendship well when it came to Benedict. Okay, so, and that's part of what I'm getting at. We all deal with rejection and frustration as part of life for all of us, right? And how we face that difficult challenges in people it shows our character, right? Our character is revealed in the crucible of adversity. And how did Washington deal with frustration? Okay, so Washington's the hero of the Monongahela. He has been the head of the Virginia Regiment from age 21 to 27, right? He's the second most famous man in America during the French and Indian War. Anybody want to guess who number one was, by the way? The most famous American? Somebody said, I think Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's number one. But George Washington, at 27, is number two, which is pretty great, right? All he wants is to wear a red uniform like his brother Lawrence. Right? He doesn't want the red and blue uniform we saw earlier. He wants to be a British officer. So he goes to Philadelphia and waits in the waiting room of this guy, Lord Loudoun's waiting room, in March of 1757 for 2 weeks. Loudon finally lets him in, yells at him, says he's an upstart, know-nothing British colonial. Go back to your little hamlet of Virginia and get out of my face. It utterly humiliates George. George gets really mad, and he looks forward to a better life, right? That's how, and by the way, he never forgot how he was treated, but he then, by the way, ran for the House of Burgesses and did a lot of other things to move his life forward, relying, by the way, in no small part of the advice of his mentors. Let's talk about Benedict. So Benedict helped capture Fort Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen. Those guns were in turn then used to capture Boston. He led the attack on Quebec and was known as the Hannibal of the North. He fought a battle and built an entire navy and fought the British to a standstill at Valcour Island and saved the Revolution for an entire year. It's an unbelievable story. While he was home, Danbury, Connecticut was attacked and he fought the British back into the water. And he was the hero of Saratoga and won the Battle of Saratoga. He is our greatest general, by the way, if I didn't mention that, right? As I said. But he gets severely wounded at Saratoga. And George doesn't know what to do with them because he's so wounded. So he sends him to Philadelphia as the governor of Philadelphia. And we think of the Revolution as this monolith, but it wasn't. There was the radical part of the revolution and the conservatives. The conservatives generally were supporting the army and George. And the radicals, led by this guy, Joseph Reed, is in Philadelphia, and they're worried, they're terrified that this is going to happen. Anybody who knows, this is pretty obscure. This is Oliver Cromwell. He was the boogeyman of the American Revolution, right? Because, and for good reason, because what happens? If you win a revolution, like Oliver Cromwell, what do you get to be? Lord Protector for life, right? Choose whoever you want. Napoleon, Kim Jong-un, Castro. Everybody makes themselves head for life, right? And so they feared, for good reason, that when the revolution was over, George would be king for life, right? That's what they all thought would happen. What they didn't know was they had George Washington, right? And George didn't do it, but they could not attack George directly. So the radicals attacked their guy, George's guy in Washington, in Philadelphia, who was Benedict Arnold. And Benedict Arnold got really mad, like really, really mad. He'd been injured, he's being politically attacked, didn't feel like he was being, I may have just died. I could talk really loud. Didn't feel like he was being adequately supported. So he contacts the British, which takes me to the importance of a good spouse. Okay. This is Martha Washington. This is not Martha with the funny hat that we all see. This is Martha in one of the earliest paintings of Martha. Martha was not a looker. That was what they didn't use those words, but they said at the time. However, Martha had something way better than looks. She was the wealthiest widow in Virginia. And George had very little money. She needed someone to help run her farms, and he needed money. But George would later write a letter to a young woman and say, much later in life, and say, marry for sound reasons. Love will come. And his relationships with Martha was the most important relationship of his life. She was his primary counselor and his friend. And she would be hugely important to him. In fact, they would get married at the end of the French and Indian War. She was pretty tough. She wouldn't marry him until the war was over because he was crazy brave. So here's their marriage in 1759. But I think what's most important with Martha is this painting, which it's hard for you guys to see it, but I think one of the most important days in American history is not July 4th, 1776. One of the most important days is this date, December 23rd, 1783. That's the date, and this is the painting of George Washington returning his commission to Congress. So the war's over, and he goes to Annapolis and hands his commission back and says, I have completed the duties you put upon me. I now return my commission and return to private life. And by the way, if you look up in the corner, see the little lady in the funny hat up on the balcony? That's Martha, and she encouraged him to do it. And unlike most people say, I want to spend a little time with my family, he meant it, right? He went back to Mount Vernon for 7 years, and I don't think he ever really wanted to be president. He did that out of duty. This electrified the world, right? George III couldn't believe it, right? No one did that, right? And by the way, all the radicals, like, Joseph Reed, they were just wrong. But it was pretty unprecedented. So anyway, I love this, and Martha played a huge role in this decision. Oh, now this just died. Boy, we were just having times here. All right, you know what? I'm going to go like this. Go this. Okay. So that's not working either. Okay, let's talk about Arnold's wife, Peggy Shippen. So Arnold ends up in Philadelphia. He's being attacked by the radicals. And he falls in love with this woman, Peggy Shippen Arnold. And she is a loyalist. Now, it is not Arnold's or Peggy's fault that he became a traitor. He was already heading down that path. But she played a major role in encouraging him. In particular, she introduced him to this guy, Major John Andre. He's the head of the British spy network, and the British had occupied Philadelphia before the Americans did, so she got to know Major Andre. And so she was in the perfect position to connect him with the head of the British spy network. So we got two spouses taking you down now absolutely different paths of history. At this point, I think we see our paths are pretty divergent. It is friends and mentors and spouses. Sometimes it's not your parents. As a parent, it's nice when sometimes it's not our fault, right? Sometimes it's friends and mentors and spouses that make the difference and made the difference for these two patriots and what path they went down. Okay, so, and it leads to this. So when Benedict commits treason, Nathaniel Green, who's going to be heavily featured, by the way, in my next book, is one of Benedict's kind of protege, or one of George's proteges, one of the main generals, and knew Benedict quite well. So right after Benedict's treason happens, he writes this to the orders of the day for the entire American military. Benedict Arnold, since the fall of Lucifer, nothing has equaled the fall of Benedict Arnold. His military reputation in Europe and America was flattering to the vanity of the first general of his age. He will now sink as low as he'd been high before, and as the devil made war upon heaven after his fall, so I expect Arnold will fall upon America. Should ever to fall into our hands, it will be sweet sacrifice. So he was, and when we were talking earlier about every country has a boogeyman, he's still our boogeyman. In contrast, George Washington, at the end of the Revolution, he is the father of our country. By the way, they called him the father of the country before the Revolution was even over. And when George III heard that he returned his commission to Congress, he said, and I quote, "He's the greatest man in the world." And that is because of the impact of the family and friends and mentors that led these two men and spouses down that separate path. Okay, so now back to the important question. You're all, by the way, going to have to raise your hand, so just everybody had to raise their hand during the Revolution. You ultimately became one side or the other. So, and I'm gonna tell you, I'll tell you what I am first. So, again, too much time thinking about this. All right, here's the test. Remember the test. I don't know if you can read it, but you know, my tests are like your rule follower kind of tests, or my wife's tests about airports and seating and stuff. I will tell you that if you look at that test, on every single one, I'm a loyalist toady. Every one. It really is frustrating, because if you spend your time writing and thinking about the revolution, you really hope you'd be a revolutionary, right? I mean, I love America, and I really hope that, so what I'd like to think of myself is I'm a loyalist toady who wishes he was rebel scum. But you know, and again, hopefully with the impact of a good spouse, my wife was a rebel on every single one of those other things. She maybe would have influenced me positively. And so, in fact, here's my family. My wife in the middle, she's the rebel, and my two boys, by the way, alternately are rebel scum and loyalist toady. So our family is all mixed up. And my shirt in the middle is made both of a Union Jack and a Stars and Stripes, because I just wish I was a rebel. Okay, so now before you raise your hand, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this. That when the revolution started, it was about 25% loyalist. About 50% were undecided, and about 25% were rebel. We think of it, again, as a monolith, but it really wasn't the case. Most people, by the way, just wanted to be left alone, right? And like most of us in the middle. It did vary by location and over time. In the South, it was more loyalist. Obviously, in New England, it was much more rebel. And then as the revolution went on, the loyalist number decreased. But it's a huge decision. And my tendency to joke aside, it puts you in their shoes. Because what people forget is the revolution was a civil war, right? And people in the room had differing views. So, given my test, what are you? So it's okay to be a loyalist. You can raise your hand if you're a loyalist like me. If you pass the loyalist test, it's okay. All right? All right. Thank you for doing that. I know it was hard. For those of you that can proudly raise your hand as rebels, go ahead. Raise your hands if you're rebels. Okay. Okay, well, interestingly, so but it's important to know that it was a civil war, but ultimately they made compromises and were able to build a great country. And either way, we've got an amazing history, so which I like to talk about. So I would love to have questions. I'll talk as long as you let me talk, as long as there's questions. Go ahead. Okay, so the question was that I'm repeating for video people was the sort of use of guerrilla warfare, not doing the traditional European standing up across from each other and blowing each other apart with guns, but us tending to fight more from behind the trees. Who brought that up, and did that make a tactical difference in the war? It's really interesting. So my first book talks a lot about this, and is that George Washington called that bushfighting. Okay, and bushfighting played a major role in the Battle of Monongahela that you saw. The French surrounded the British, who, in their red uniforms in the woods, pretty easy to see, the French and Indians shot from all around them and wiped them all out. George Washington, and they rarely used a vanguard or any scouts. which was really stupid. George Washington realized that was stupid, and he changed that tactic in the next war. Ironically, though, all of them wanted a stand-up fight, because it's still the effect of the Continentals. They looked down on us because we couldn't do a stand-up fight, right? So George really wanted to build a Continental Army that could stand up and fight the British on an open field. Now, the fact is, almost all of our greatest victories did not happen that way, right? So there's a number of instances over the Revolution where when we fought, like for Trenton, right? Think about crossing the Delaware, right? That was a traditional stand-up fight. We rolled in and did it there. There's the cow pens. There's a whole bunch of other times where we fought in more unconventional ways and we were more successful, yet all George really wanted was to beat him in a stand-up battle, and we were never particularly good at it. We got better at it as it went along, but that was our goal. But unlike the Brits, George and his generals did adapt, and they did over time use both tactics that the British were never good at and never really adapted, and that was a great advantage for us. Any other questions? Yeah. So the question was whether Benedict was jealous of George, which is a great question. The answer on that is Benedict was not jealous of George, because George was a father figure to Benedict, the father he never really had. Others were, and George was really above reproach, and really quite remarkable in everything he did in running the revolution. However, Benedict was the most successful fighting general George had. He was also rough on the edges, not as articulate, not highly educated. So some of the highly educated other generals didn't like him, in particular Horatio Gates, who was English trained, British military officer, and not a particularly good general. They called him Granny Gates because he never wanted to leave defensive positions. And so he was very, 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 very jealous of Benedict. There were a number of other generals who were also, Benjamin Lincoln, I could go on and on, who were jealous of Benedict's skills, and so they would attack him. Ethan Allen, horrible guy. Ethan Allen, very jealous of Benedict. So they would lie and mischaracterize what Benedict did. They would lie in the newspapers about what he did, and Benedict did not take that well, which is part of the process that led him to the dark side. And it was a steady progression by people who, and also he was unlucky. There were some generals who really did like him, like Richard Montgomery, with whom he stormed Quebec, but he got his head blown off. So he was often unlucky in his choice of friends. Yeah. All right, so the question was, why do you do this? Why my background? All right, so I trained as a lawyer, right? And I'm a nerd. As I got older, I read more and more biography, right? And then it started with George, more and more biography. And I went through a Civil War period, World War II period, I read all that kind of stuff. I read a lot. But George is so unique, right? He gave up power twice. They wanted him. Believe me, Alexander Hamilton was ready to make him king. And how and why did he do that? And that led me to the story of my first book, right? By the end of my first book, you really understand why he didn't like the British and why he became king, how he could walk away from power. That willingness to do that was so incredible. And then I found a story that no one knew. Everybody knows the story about George and the Delaware and all that, but no one knows the story about the French and Indian War. And, by the way, in the first book, he's a little less than ideal. He does lie a little bit, and he wants to get away from his mom. And by the way, there's a love story. He falls in love with Sally Fairfax, who's married. George is not married. I think it's important to point that out. This is before Martha. So it's a love story. It's a great story. So the story burns in my head, right? And I can't help it. Next thing you know, I'm saying to my wife, I'm going to buy a couple of books. Maybe going to write a book. And then 100 books arrive at our house, right? And so that burned in my head. And then what happens is my books are historical fiction, but heavy on the historical. So the back of my books, there's full bibliographies, there's full author's notes. I tell you where I'm guessing and where I'm not, right? Which one of the things I don't like in historical fiction, they just make something up. Nothing's made up in terms of what happened. But I have to make some decisions. For example, did George have an affair with Sally Fairfax? Yes or no? No historian really knows. But I get to write the historical fiction. The answer is yes. But in the back, you can read about what all the historical fiction authors say about it. So writing dialogue, it's super cool. So I start writing dialogue, and then, oh, by the way, now I know the story about Benedict Arnold once. Well, I'm studying about Washington. And I'm like, well, that's a cool story. Nobody seems to really know about this. I start talking to my friends. Do you know anything about Benedict Arnold? Well, he's a traitor. Do you know anything else? Not really. Oh, wow, that's a cool story. I should write that. And now, my next book, which is Becoming Victorious, which I've just started, a few books are arriving in my house, in fact, this week, which is from the fall of Charleston. So George has lost his best general. He's lost Benedict Arnold. And the British have decided they're engaged. Things did not go well in New England because of Benedict Arnold. So they decide they're going to do the Southern strategy. And they invade and take Charleston, one of the greatest defeats of the Revolution until that. And under a guy named Benjamin Lincoln, who had also fought with George at Saratoga. Anyway, he really has no one to send, right? So George sends 4 knuckleheads down to, who are fascinating guys, including Nathaniel Greene, down to Charleston. They're outnumbered 10-1 against the best British general they have, Cornwallis, and this evil guy, Barrister Tarleton, who's right out of Central Casting. Anyway, they cause the British to chase them all over the Carolinas, and I don't want to ruin it for you, but we win at the Battle of Yorktown, right? And so that's my next story. It's called Becoming Victorious. So that just led me to another one. So I don't know. I mean, and they're fun. You hear voices in your head, which I think is a good thing. But either way, it's really fun. So that's a long answer to a short question. I just love it, and it's a lot of fun. And I love the stories of the Revolution. Yeah. Yeah, so he said I left out cow pens and some of the southern batters, and that Washington didn't really want to stand up fight. That desire to not want to stand up fight was called the Fabian strategy, based upon the strategy that Fabian Maximus used with the Romans. And he did want to stand up fight, but he didn't really get one until a little bit Yorktown and here and there. And my next book, The Cow Pens, which was really engineered by a guy named Daniel Morgan, who's very heavily featured in my current book. So Daniel Morgan leads the Americans and defeats Barrister Tarleton, the really bad guy, at the cow pens. So it's the Southern story is just it's a great story. I mean, okay, the 4 guys: Daniel Morgan, who's shoots long rifles; Light Horse Harry Lee, who is the grandfather of Robert E. Lee; Nathaniel Greene, only man in American history ever to be promoted directly from private to general; and the last horn, Baron von Steuben, who was not a baron. It builds the American military manual and was definitely gay. So these 4 guys are just terrific, and they're the ones who are going to defeat Cornwallis. So it's a great story. Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, Washington really was his greatest contribution that he gave up power and didn't become king. He was an okay general, and I think 100%. There are probably other generals that might have won the war and could have won the war. Benedict Arnold could have won the war. I don't know if he could have kept the coalition together that Washington kept together. Washington, a bit like Eisenhower, was good at checking his ego, but his ability to step away twice. By the way, the other one is at the end of his second term, right? At the end of his second term, I say it once because we just did the first time in December of 1783, which is electrifying. But the second one is, okay, you're president, thanks. You're going to stay for king, right? And if you've seen the wonderful play Hamilton, Hamilton really did not want George to step down. And George really did. He never really wanted to be president. But he felt his need to serve his country. And he felt the need to step down so that there would be a peaceful transition of power and an election. And he knew that there was a chance that Thomas Jefferson, who he really did not like, would be elected president. But he was willing to risk it because he believed at the end of the day, Jefferson, while a very flawed person, would be okay if he was president because democracy was more important. And there's a lot of wonderful letters he wrote at the end. And by the way, every letter George ever sent or received has been put together by the University of Virginia in what's called the George Washington Papers. So in my books, you can get everything they wrote, and they're heavily annotated. So they're just wonderful. And one of the cool things about George is we have some of the first letters he ever wrote, and we have some of the last. And his insecurity about his education is so telling because by the time he's done, he's a brilliant writer, right? He spent his life learning how to write well. And it's so cool to see he continued to progress. And that's one of the things I admire most about him is his ability to grow. I think we all, need to try to continue to grow. I think that's one of the wonderful things about all of you taking your time in the Rotary and making the world a better place, because it's about, continuing to do that through your whole life. So that's one of the wonderful things about George that I think you all share with him. That's not a bad way to end. Okay, go ahead, Jim. Dang, that was a good ending. All right, go ahead.
Where do we buy your book?
Oh, God, I love you. Okay. Where do I buy my book? First of all, it's available on all platforms, Kindle, Amazon. Also, there's an audio version of Benedict with a guy whose voices are just incredible. He does all the voices. It's women, men, it's fabulous. His George is perfect. I have some books here, if you want to buy some, both Benedict and George. And otherwise, they're available on Amazon. And also, if you go to my website, yoch.com, and on your table is bookmarks, please take them. And that takes you to my website where you can buy local too if you want to. So I think that's probably it. Thank you all very much. It was wonderful talking.